find out about a new industry, IT, and to learn all the different buzzwords and the different sides of marketing and building websites and business side of it. It's very good, very good. It's a good opportunity for people to network and get information off each other, as well as go to the presentations and listen to what people have to say. So it's excellent, and it's informal, and it's a good opportunity for people to mix.
Not talking today, bad eye, too many distractions and trying to focus. So no, today I'm just listening, which has been good. Online stuff, I was in for the talk on pay-per-click with Jordan. It was on about the improving landing pages on your website. So just stuff about getting better being online, which was good. It was definitely a very interesting morning for me.
Maybe somebody types in, I'm looking for a cyan widget, it'll say, well, that's pretty close to blue, yeah, we'll show your ad. And somebody...
So, let's talk about the problem. I'm sure you're all familiar with this expression, why spare the ship for a paper tartar? Okay, clearly you're all not sailors. So there is often that part in your journey to go and create a new project where you come across a fabulous idea and you just can't get anybody to invest in it. And sometimes you look at some ideas that are invested in and you say to yourself, what were they thinking? So, for example, here are a couple of my projects. So here's a project I was very passionate about. I wanted to buy a boat. I had a very good campaign and a great business plan and passion and energy, and I bought myself a boat. And the very first thing that I learned about buying a boat is that the two happiest days in a boat owner's life are the day they buy the boat and the day they sell the boat. Nobody told me that until I'd bought the boat. And then I had this fabulous idea for a waterproof IBM ThinkPad. On the day that I dropped my IBM ThinkPad off the boat, and the diver who comes to my boat every 4 months and scrapes the bottom, gets all the crud off the bottom, recovered my ThinkPad for me, and you can see why I think that a waterproof ThinkPad would be a good idea. So I have not been able to get the investors in Silicon Valley where I live to invest in this idea of waterproof ThinkPads yet, but I will be continuing to do so. I just need to come up with a compelling business plan. Convincing myself to buy a boat was easy because all I had to do was convince myself. And now I have a boat. Okay, so what is value engineering? Value engineering is a business analysis process. It goes through 3 phases. We call them discovery, realization, and optimization. Why do we call them that? Because it sounds sophisticated and clever, and the reality is it's not very sophisticated or clever. It's very easy. We'll start by talking about the discovery phase. And the discovery phase says, I need to find out everything about what's going on in your business so I can help you build a business plan. And so a value engineer will come visit you, and they'll spend a little time with you talking to you and the key members of your team about what it is that you do. And the idea is to try and elicit from everybody their ideas about whatever project is that you want to pursue next. So it might be that you want to automate some part of your business. It might be that you want to develop some new sales and marketing strategy. Maybe you want to enter a new market. And so the value engineer comes with a clean sheet of paper, usually a clean piece of glass on their iPad, and they start taking notes. And they interview 7 to 9 of the key members of staff that you have. If you don't have 7 to 9, that's okay. If you only have 3 or 4, we interview 3 or 4 people. And we learn everything we can. Now, what's really good about being a value engineer is people will tell you the most extraordinary things. And I've done value engineering engagements for very small businesses and for massive, giant, internationally known corporations. And the good news is people will tell value engineers anything. And they often tell me things that they absolutely would not tell their boss. And in that process of discovery, we gather all those ideas and we start to distill them down. And we synthesize them into the key strategies that the business ought to be following. And then we go away. And we go away and we do some research. because we find that most businesses are so busy running the business that they forget. They forget that they're in a market and there are other businesses doing similar things, and so we engage with those other businesses by doing research, often through the net, sometimes in more subtle ways, to find out what they're thinking about that particular task. So recently I was talking to a telephone company, and they wanted to be #1 in their market, and currently they were #3 in their market. And so we looked at how the #1 player got there and the #2 player got there, and indeed we looked at how the #4 and 5 player in that market were getting there. And so we were able to put their strategy in context with all of their competitors. I spoke with a very small business in the high-tech space here in Northern Ireland recently, and their strategy was to keep out of the way of everybody else. They were aiming at a piece of the market that nobody else was occupying, and they wanted to make sure they owned it and could prevent their competitors getting in there. So they were looking at a defensive strategy, and so they wanted to see how other people had kept out of their market as well. So there are lots of things that we do as part of the value engineering engagement in the discovery process, and the idea is to build this enormous picture of what's happening to your business. And from that then we sit down and we spend some time writing a report. We're very old-fashioned as value engineers. We write the report and then we write the presentation. There are a lot of people these days who now think that PowerPoint is the documentation, and all they ever do is they go straight to PowerPoint and they bang out a bunch of slides, and there's no depth to the slide, there's no meat behind them. And so we're very vigorous about report writing, and we write these big thick reports. The telco report was more than 50 pages deep. The report for the high-tech company here in Northern Ireland was 25 pages deep, and it talked about every aspect of their business. After the discovery phase, after we found out where everybody wants to go, what everybody's ideas are, what the competitive landscape is, we get to the realization phase. And that realization phase means going back to the business after some days of research and presenting that report and presenting the summary of that report through a presentation. And that's a very short process because the information gets distilled down into what are the key actionable tasks that the business should undertake in order to achieve that next project. We also then hang around for a long period of time, often it's a couple of hours, and answer questions. Because what's remarkable is, as value engineers, we often know much more about the business after 2 days talking to staff members and doing research about the business and competitors than even the founders of that business know about their own business themselves. And that information can come quite as a shock. And there are often moments that are epiphanies, there are often moments of shock, occasionally there are moments of shame. But the purpose here then is to get everybody literally on the same page about where the business is and where it's going and perhaps where it ought to be going. In the report then, we've been tasked with looking at a particular project area, a particular direction, and then we'll start to enumerate out what are the recommendations for that business as the things that they ought to do that would get them to the goal that they'd set for themselves. Sometimes, and it's actually quite often, we'll say to them, you know, the goal that you're aiming for, what you're really directing yourself towards is actually something else, and really the real goal is this thing over here, and you ought to go straight to that goal rather than take this long way around which your competitors have already worked out. And we also then sit down with them and develop a project plan as to how they could execute it. The idea is that the value engineers come in and they become the extra time that the business leaders in their own organization never have. Because most business leaders, I find, what they do is they spend all of their time running their business and none of their time directing their business. Quite often, particularly here in the United Kingdom, we refer to those leaders as directors of the business, but they spend very little time directing. They spend most of their time managing, and frankly, they spend most of their time firefighting. So as value engineers, we come in and we become that thing that they should be doing, which is thinking about the business and the direction, and together then we build a plan which is achievable for them. And part of that plan is to deliver a report in terms of value. Now, a lot of people these days have started to become very upset about this term ROI, return on investment, because return on investment usually has got two elements to it. One is how can we save costs, and the second one is how can we increase revenue. And saving costs, the number one way of saving costs is by reducing headcount. The number one way of growing revenue is by growing headcount, by growing more salespeople. And so these two things are in conflict. What we know as value engineers is that in every organization there are massive amounts of pent-up value. Most businesses are riddled with inefficiency. I spoke to a large organization recently, and when we completed our study with them, we were able to show empirically that 17% of all the effort they were putting in their business was rework. That was people redoing something else that somebody had already done, allegedly correctly. And that's because this organization had very little oversight, it had no gates, it had no controls, it had no processes essentially, such that for every person in the organization, 1 day in 5 was spent redoing something that somebody else had done. A tremendous waste of that organization's talent. And just by liberating that 17%, they were able to increase their productivity significantly, the quality of what they did significantly, and their customers ultimately had much greater satisfaction in the service that was being delivered, simply because they were getting things earlier and they were right every time. And so it's that kind of insight that value engineering is about. It's going to the core, the pent-up value in an organization and liberating it. It's not about reducing staff, it's not about increasing staff, it's about finding those pockets of value that are not currently being exercised. And so that report, the final part of that report then is to say, there is this much pent-up value in your business, and here's how you might liberate it. After the realization phase is completed then, we go into the optimization phase. This is when I get to buy a big boat. That's the other thing about boat ownership is you always want a bigger boat. And optimization then says that as a value engineer, we've got all of this experience in your business, we've also got all of this experience in everybody else's business, such that we want to now be co-pilots. You'll find that a lot of consulting engagements that you have operate on the principle of show up and throw up. That is to say, they turn up, they pontificate about what it is they've learned, and then they leave. Value engineering is about proving the pudding, and that means that the value engineers stay around. So they stay around to mentor the executives, they stay around to measure the improvements that are being delivered, they stay around to make sure that the business case that gets presented maybe to investors or to the board or to the department head, that presentation is successful, so they coach on the presentation, they provide all the research data that backs up the numbers, and then they help manage the project, and they finally make sure that any modifications to the plan are implemented if things start to go off track over time. And so value engineering then is about staying engaged with the process. So value engineering then is this new approach to getting your next project funded. The idea is that you bring in one of these experts and they sit beside you and they work out where you want to get to and they help you get there while you carry on running your business. Let me talk to you about some of the results that we've experienced from this, and these are some quotes from some customers. So remember I mentioned that large telco at the end of the presentation in the realization phase. This gentleman said, you told me everything I already knew and quite a lot besides, which is interesting. It's interesting that most executives really do know what's going on in their business, but they never internalize it and process it and make it an action plan. That requires a great deal of self-discipline to stop fighting fires and start thinking about the business. Another client said, we've never been able to build a plan before. Not only do we now have a plan, but we have priorities. I remember my very first boss saying to me, Kevin, there can only be one priority one. But we often are faced with that challenge in our business where we have to deal with multiple priorities at the same time. I met with a client recently in Sweden, and at the end of the presentation the client said, is there anything that you did not write in the report? And I said, actually, yes. There's way too much secrecy in your department. And the rest of her team were sitting around the table, and there was an audible gasp. There were 10 people in the room, and 8 of them gasped. The only 2 who didn't gasp was the director in charge of this organization and me. And all these Swedes went, and she said, why has nobody ever said this to me before? You're right. There is way too much secrecy in our organization. We plan projects, but we don't engage the team in the planning. We just tell them what the plan is. We design products. We don't engage them in the design. We just tell them what the design is. And you're right. There needs to be more engagement with the team. And that gasp from 8 Swedes was followed by a sigh from 8 Swedes and 1 Brit. Because it's a kind of a bold thing to say to somebody who's paying the bills, that they're too secretive. And I talked to a client recently who told me that they have absolutely no way of measuring which projects they're working on that make a profit and which that don't. Because they're so busy working on the projects. And actually the very idea of putting in systems to measure how much work is done on each project compared to how much revenue is collected, that seemed like that ought to be a business priority. And it hadn't occurred before in their business because their business was riding on a tide of success. So value engineering provides value in many different ways, let alone the information that gets you there. If you'd like a value engineering engagement, you can have one. All you need to do is contact me. But right now I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Have you ever, Kevin, gone into a situation where you weren't able to help?
So far, no. So don't tell anybody I ever said this, but here's the interesting piece of news. Most businesses are experiencing the same problem in terms of business maturity, irrespective of their organizational size, their geography, their culture, or even the business that they're in. Right now, I can tell you that the #1 thing that's causing most businesses to be less effective than they should be is the fact that they have no systems to support their business. Now, there are systems. There are finance systems. There are sales systems. We've got all these tools in the cloud, but there is nothing that integrates the system together. And organizations are really suffering from the fact that everything is pretty siloed. Most people integrate their businesses, integrate the sales and marketing function with finance, integrate the distribution systems with the warehouse, using the most powerful and potentially lethal integration tool known to mankind, Microsoft Outlook. Yeah, most people do integration of their businesses by email. And it doesn't matter whether or not it's 2 people running a small manufacturing company, or whether or not it's 10,000 people running a motor manufacturing company. So the good news is that everybody needs help. The other universal truth is that most people who run businesses, whether or not it's a small business or a department or an international enterprise, most people are spending their time fighting fires. One of the things that's really interesting to me is one of the questions I always ask businesses is, how many exceptions do you have? Now, exceptions should be that. They should be exceptional. But most businesses will report to me, oh, it's, you know, maybe 15, 20% exceptions. That is, that as a manager, they have to step in and make a decision 1 in 5 times. So this order that came in, are we going to take it in its current form? Are we going to take on this job because it might not be profitable? Are we going to engage with this client because they don't have proper funding? 15% is the typical number I hear of businesses saying that's how their exceptions are. And it ranges, I've heard as high as 25%. If you're at that level of exceptions, you're never going to manage your business because you're going to be making decisions. And so most businesses are lacking policies, they're lacking procedures, they're lacking best practices, and as a result of that, they're lacking in process. And it's those 4 Ps, to echo one of the speakers earlier, it's those 4 Ps that matter to me the most. Best practices, policies that define how the business goes, procedures that show how things should be followed, and processes that are automated throughout the organization so that handoffs happen in the best way. And when you can put those 4 Ps into practice, your business runs itself to a large extent, and you get on with the job of managing it, and you don't need me because you have the time to run your business.
Just also from a selling point of view, if you want to sell your business on and you have all of that information documented, that's actually the tangibility of your business.
Yes.
You know, and often businesses, I saw somebody speak very recently, and they were selling their business on, and it took them 2 years to sell their business on because nothing was documented.
Yes.
So when they had everything documented, they were able to then show this is the business.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent point. Due diligence is a vital part of any merger and acquisition process. And if you can't prove that you have financial controls in place, if you can't prove that you can demonstrate the profitability of your business on the individual unit sale, if you can't show data that says how your business operates, it makes it very hard for you to sell your business because the investor thinks that all of the intellectual property is in your heart and in your head. And whilst your business is in your heart and your head, the actual execution of your business needs to be in systems, whether or not they're paper systems or computer systems, they need to be in systems. So that's an excellent point. Do feel free to come and bully me later. I'm here all day. And I thank you for your time and your patience. Thank you.